All right. So we're going to be focusing on world building. Now, what is world building and why is it important? World building is one of the cornerstones of writing. Next to plot and character creation, it is probably the most important aspect about any book. You can't have characters if there's no place for them to go home. You can't have a battle of good and evil without a battlefield. And there's no story if there's no world to put it in. Now, while it can also be a bit scary when you think about world building, it's not necessarily because of the difficulty, but also because of what it means. Like I said in the slide, it is the deciding factor of your genre. If your story is sci-fi, then your setting, your world has to show that. You can't just say your world is sci-fi and yet never have a single sci-fi setting in your entire novel. Same thing applies with fantasy or horror or thriller. You could have the best plot ever put to paper. You could have the best characters ever put on screen. But if you don't have a world to put them in, then it's not really all that useful. Now, specifically, world building focuses on not just the physical world, but also on the people that inhabit it. Please remember, and I cannot stress this enough, because this happens more often than some of us are care to admit when we first write our stories, is that we tend to make the world revolve around our characters. We tend to have things that are a little bit too convenient. For example, having the world's deadliest poison suddenly be healed by this plant the character always carries on them, or something to that effect. You see, you have to remember that the world exists outside of your character's influence. Maybe not all the time. You could easily just do a major good versus evil plot, and in that case, the world does technically revolve around your character. But the people within it don't necessarily only exist when your character is near them. You have to keep that in mind when you're writing. You have to make sure that when you are making a story, whether it's about superheroes, whether it's about a dystopian future, that you have to remember to put in those details about how the average person feels about this world, how the average person sees this world. Now, there are two types of methods of world building. And these are my names, not necessarily like official names or anything like that, but they're just so that it's easier for me to explain. The blank page method is you just start from scratch. Every artist, no matter if you're into music, drawing, doesn't matter. You start with a blank page. And what comes out of that page, that creation you make, that is how you're going to start the world. You start off with nothing, and then you create it. You fill that empty space with an entire world. And the pre-made method. This is possibly the easier of the two. And that is when you use elements that's already known. Say, for example, you wanted to write a fantasy novel, but you didn't want to go through that whole effort of creating an entire world, or you just didn't want to get to that point yet. You could simply introduce fantasy elements into, like, say, Makanda. Simply just write about people in Makanda and then just add fantasy onto it. That's technically a pre-made world, because the history of Makanda, the people within Makanda, and the actual layout of Makanda has already been made for you. You're just using those elements. You're using those assets to basically serve as a pre-made foundation for your story. Now, what are the benefits of the blank page method? Well, like I said, you're basically God. You make all the rules of this world. If you want the entire world to be ruled by dragons, you can. You want the entire world to be created by toads and frogs and newts, go ahead. But there are kind of bad things about this too. And when I say, and one of those big things is that when I say you create everything, I really do mean everything. Everything from the freaking giant floating castle in the sky to the small rock your character trips over once. That's all you. You have to make sure that you have a kind of blueprint, at least in your mind, of locations in terms of where your characters go, of history in each location, so that you can keep in mind what where your characters go, what your characters go through. If you have a swamp full of poison gas and stuff like that your characters need to go past, map that out. You need to map that out. It's not going to be pre-made for you. And also, if you're going to use a couple of assets from the real world, like mythological creatures, you're going to also need to make sure that there are biomes that they can survive in. If you're going to use sci-fi elements and say, oh, there's this entire race that's home planet lives in the water, how do they survive on that? If you're going to have a horror novel with either evil spirits or just a psychopath with an axe, where do you get that axe? How is he strong enough to lift the axe? These are questions that help with your plot. They help your characters. They help make not just your characters, but your entire world seem more real. Now, here are some examples of worlds I would consider blank pages. Lord of the Rings, Tolkien created all of that. He might have taken elements from Norse mythology, yeah, but pretty much all of Middle-earth is his. The society, their history, that's all him. Same thing with Star Wars. Yeah, there are elements from either the hero's journey or small elements from moments in mythology that you could analyze until the day you die. But the overall creation of Star Wars is still George Lucas's. He made that world. And then there's also the Hunger Games. Now, dystopian futures technically fall under blank pages, because while they may use our history, they don't always allude to it being our history. That's just generally the assumption made. So what you can tend to do, so if you're making a dystopian future, then it's more than fine if you use assets from our world in terms of history. It just all depends on how much you use. I put Hunger Games to the back pages one because it didn't immediately jump out to me that we were still on Earth. It was more like a realm similar to Earth kind of deal. So I still consider that a blank page, even if technically. And then you got pre-made. Now, pros and cons for pre-made. Keep in mind, some novels like the Percy Jackson series and the technically Harry Potter series, though that's heavily debatable, are considered pre-made because they use elements from the world. In terms of Harry Potter, pretty much every fantastic beast and spell and stuff like that is based off real world concepts, either Latin mythology or the fact that she travels around London. The same thing applies for Percy Jackson, in which case pretty much the only unique thing about the book are the characters and how the mythology is interwoven with modern society. Now, the pros of this, because that your foundation of your world is already set for you, and you don't need to spend all that much time on it, you can really focus on the characters. In that case, it saves you a lot of time. You don't need to spend hours developing systems of magic or species coexistence, etc. That's already sorted for you if you pick the right elements. And also, if you really love the world that you wanted to make your story be inspired from, then you can basically live out your fantasy in your favorite world. But the con is that you don't get as much freedom. You are restricted on how the world works and where your characters can go, especially if you decide to write a fan fiction that takes place at the same time as the events in your favorite story. And if you want that fan fiction to seem more immersive and less of a I'm taking over that story kind of thing. I mean, it's your story, you can do what you want, but there are still technically restrictions. You also have to do a ton of research on the world you're in. You can't just take a glance at, let's say, the Skullduggery Pleasant novels and think, oh, okay, I'm going to make a wizard. No. You need to know the terms they use. You need to know the history that they've been through and the general consensus between them. You need to know these things about another person's world. I think, though, that the worst con that out of this is the fact of expectations. Depending on how many elements from a pre-established world you used, you're going to have a certain amount of expectations about said world. If you take it from a popular genre or series, then fans of that genre and series are going to be judging you based on that. If you just take elements of the real world, like I said, if you just decide to lift Makanda up and put it in your story and add whichever elements you want to it, then people that live within Makanda are going to be reading it and just thinking, okay, did they get this wrong? Did they get this right? I don't recognize this, that kind of stuff. That's probably the biggest con for me, because at least for me, wise, that's a bit anxiety inducing. Now, these are technically pre-made worlds. Like I said, you got the Lightning Thief. You got books like I Am Legend, because in that actual book, they talk about how they used to be our world and then zombie virus. And then you got Treasure Island, which is technically historical fiction. So it does take elements from our world, like history, laws, that kind of stuff, and uses that. I also put the Aeneid in there in small text because, yes, I'm a tad bit salty that Virgil literally ripped off the Odyssey for most of that. And those of you in classics know exactly what I mean. But yeah, these are technically considered pre-made. There are definitely more examples for both of these methods than I have put up here. These are not the be-all, end-all. You can probably think of a dozen more examples than I am right now. So there are other world building methods, right? And I'm just going to point this out. There is nothing wrong with either method that I pointed out here. And while, like I said, they are mainly my names for them, they're not the scientific names for it. There's nothing wrong with using either of them. If you're like me and you like to have total control over your world, go ahead, that's fine, you do you. However, if you're a little bit more, I'm gonna say, motivated and decide to use a pre-made elements, go ahead. I have used both of these methods for two different stories. And I personally prefer the blank page one, even though there are many times where I just spend weekends drawing up maps and writing and rewriting histories. And it took me an entire month to figure out a whole magic system that's worth it. It's still like completely up to you and what you want to do. Just because one of them might technically be harder than the other does not necessarily mean it's better than the other. They both have merits to them. It's your world, you build it how you want. My best advice to start on world building is to, at the very least, have your overarching story planned out. You don't need to have your characters or anything like that sorted, but if you know what kind of plot you want to do, then you can build your world to support that kind of plot. You can't have a chosen one narrative in a world where essentially there's no such thing as a chosen one. You cannot have a system like the Jedi in a world where there's no fantasy and no sci-fi. It doesn't necessarily work as well. So my best advice is to make sure that you build your world alongside your narrative, alongside your plot. If you want to start your world first, that's great. That's perfectly fine. I'm just saying that it's a lot easier to build your world if you know what kind of plot you're going to do. Now, when I say, is it easier to create a world with your partner? I mean, like, I often ask my friends for information about worlds I created, for information about characters and stuff like that. And that's fine. In my opinion, it's a lot easier to get a world, let's say, off the ground, so to speak, if you're able to talk it out, if you're able to actually brainstorm with a few other people and get some of the elements out. Because if you can explain your world to your friends, right, then whatever questions they ask you, you need to be prepared for it. If you can't answer a question someone else asks you about your world, then you know there's no more world building to be done. This also includes pre-made worlds, by the way. It doesn't necessarily just mean a blank, it's not just a blank page thing, this question. It's literally even with pre-made worlds. If you decide to make a world like Shadowhunters, and I ask you, okay, where did X and Y methods of hunting shadows come from? You need to be able to answer that. Now, in terms of tools, in what I mean by tools, I mean like what physical tools can you use to help you out? Like I said, I like drawing maps and I like drawing characters because that's how I visually see things. So what you can do, in my opinion, in my advice, is that maybe get a notebook or something and just keep notes of different things in your world. If you got a great memory, awesome, you probably don't need this. But it is definitely handy to be able to write some of these things down. I'd highly suggest you making a Word or PowerPoint or anything like that, just so that you could have the information you need ready. So if you want to remember what town 3 miles west of the main character's village is called, what the main town 3 miles west of your character's village is called, you have the notes there. If you want to remember what kingdom they're in, you have the notes there. That kind of thing. Now, how would one practice this? So what I would suggest is try writing a few sentences down as an introduction to it. Make it in whatever narrative perspective that you want. And this is going to serve as a proper introduction to your reader. These few sentences are going to allow your reader to experience your world and honestly see, basically giving them a taste of what your world has to offer. So, yeah. These are 2 examples that I made about this. Now, just to give you an example, the first one's pre-made, the second one is blank page. So the first one, as you can see, as the sun begins to set upon London, the Thames resembling molten golden sunlight. Immediately you know where the story is, and you can visualize where that is. If I list a location in London that you don't know, you can easily look it up and you can get a better map of this world. However, in the second one, when I just say our village lay on the outskirts of the Rygov kingdom, and yet even there we could see the fires, hell beasts, mortal choices. You're given more about this world that it is so unlike ours, that is high fantasy or it's probably horror, whichever. And that's what I'm talking about here. These are like examples of what I want you to try do with your stories here. I'm just going to go back to this and I'm going to pause the sharing, but I'm going to bring it up in a minute just to check if we have any questions, because I cannot see questions on this. All right, so does anyone have any questions regarding anything I've said here? Just like type them in chat. I can see the chat now. Okay, Markan, what's your question?
So I was gonna ask about how much detail is enough when world building, because I recall one of the major criticisms that Lord of the Rings got was that, you know, like Tolkien spent a lot of time, you know, talking about, you know, what others described as unnecessary details. Now, personally, I think that added to the experience of the books. But I guess, you know, like everyone has different tastes. So how do you sort of strike that balance between too many details about your world and then maybe not having enough?
Oh, that's actually a really good question. So in my opinion, I agree with you that I think there are a lot of details in Tolkien in Tolkien's work, like the fact that he spent I think like 2 pages describing a flower. But to me, it all depends on what your world is. If you're going to go into sci-fi, then no, you don't need to put in a lot of detail. If you're going to go into horror, sometimes the lack of detail adds to the suspense. If you're going to go into fantasy, then you're going to have to make up a lot of stuff if it involves magic. However, in terms of too much detail, I really don't think that there is such a thing. I think it's all about your writing and the world you're in. It depends all on how you're writing it and what your world is, in my opinion. Like the fact is, I know plenty of people who are writing now using that blank page method, and they can answer pretty much any question you ask them about their world. History, people, what lies 300 miles south of X location, they can answer it. But it literally is all dependent on you. So if you want to write something like and name every village within a 300-mile radius of where your people start, then go ahead. But it's also up to you how much you want to put into the novel. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
All right, anyone else have anything? Okay, so those of you who are left, because I see we kind of lost a few people, pretty sure it's because of other things. Let's give us, I'll say 5 minutes, I'll say 10 minutes. I'll put it on my phone and we'll see, and we'll just try doing this. Just write a few, like I said, just write a few sentences, and it can be anything. It can be from a world you've already created. It can be, you can use elements from like Makanda, like I said, or any place you've been. And let's just write a few opening lines to your world. All right, let's start. Now, this is a world I've already created, but it does illustrate my point. There were heavy clouds hovering over London, covering the sky with a curtain of darkness. The smell of ozone filled the air, and I watched the moon disappear above the thick canopy of the storm. The giant clock beneath my perch chimed and the heavens opened, their tears littering the earth beneath them. I disliked the rain. It always left a weird feeling on my gray scales that made me shiver as it traveled down my back in the space between my large wings. Normally, in a stormy night like this, I'd be wearing a long cloak to cover myself. But I had idiotically assumed there'd be no rain tonight when I left the sanctuary. That was stupid. It is London after all. Why wouldn't it rain? Would anyone else like to share?
Oh, I was just going to comment on like how well done that was. I really
Thank you.
like that already you could tell that, you know, you're building on sort of the pre-made world that you're talking about. So, you know, the pre-made world being London, but then we can already tell that this is like a fantasy as well, you know, because of the fact that the character has scales and wings. Perhaps they could be a monster. So yeah, I just thought that was really good. Like it really introduces you to the world like right off the bat.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Does any of Com have anything they want to share? Or
I'd like to go ahead.
go ahead.
So this is from something I've been working on for a while now, but yeah, so everyone's so tall here. Makes me wonder what they've been feeding us on world, Ursula said as she took in the room and placed a finger food in her mouth. This is as big as one of my Tomahawk's landing bays, she thought. Ursula turned to Kerman, who looked as though he was eager to say something. Ursula figured she may as well let him. It would give her a chance to unpack the last day or so in her mind while he spoke. She wouldn't admit it, but her stomach had seen that space travel sure knew how to leave an impression. It's less about the diet and more about the light emitted from Rhea's pearl. You see, it possesses innumerable properties that us off-roaders are incredibly sensitive to, Kerman said as he addressed her comment. He had finally found the calm in his voice since the first time that evening. Off-roaders, he thought, That word floated at the edge of the conversation, making subtle attempts to remind them of how different they seemingly were. Ray is pearl. Is it your god of sorts? Ursula asked. Not mine, but I can see the likeness. It mirrors a god by being the sole power source that maintains the Polar Centauri, Kerman said as he took another sip from his tea. That's why everything is based on this crimson light, yes? Ursula asked. Right on the mark. There's not a single nook or cranny that isn't exposed to it somehow. Nearly everyone in the city doesn't know what life is without it. It's all thanks to the nerium collected by the Serpentide.
Wow, that was really amazing. I like the use of the common terms like off-worlder, because that immediately just tells you, okay, you're not on Earth anymore. And I love the terms that you put in, and like the like supposed history that already exists here. You can already tell that this character already knows a lot more about, like a lot more than the reader does about the world. And I'm eager to see where that goes.
Thank you, I appreciate it a lot.
Does anyone else have any other comments, or did I want to read out their own world?
I have mine. It's like, it's not too long because it's like I haven't done too much, but like I guess I could read like what I worked on so far.
Please, I'm eager to see what you guys wrote.
Okay. Okay, that's it. The sun was always weak and shining over the. Sorry, the sun was always. Hold on. I think I messed something up. Okay. The sun always shone weakly over the town. With the, yo, I'll just type it out because it's like, I can't, okay.
No worries. Oh, do you mind if I read it out?
Yeah, please.
Okay. The sun always shone weakly over the town, with the streets and stores barely occupied with people as time passed. At a time like 5 p.m., the citizens would finish their day as they kept themselves safe from the haunting night that unleashes itself. Ooh.
Like for some small kind of context, it's basically like, this is just like from a story I've already been working on, with like the town area. It's more like it's not that populated, so I just wanted to like kind of hint or just imply that it's like ish kind of town. It's not that full and populated. And then even how like in the nighttime there's like stuff that goes on with ghosts and people being possessed. So it's that thing where like this is doesn't know that this kind of goes on. So like most people, they usually like go stay in their homes early so that like in the streets that nothing happens to them and such, if that makes sense.
Oh, sounds actually kind of interesting. I want to learn more about this. Yeah.
Because like there's like I've had the story for a while, but it's just like this was kind of the first time I like wrote, like anything about the world building. So yeah.
No worries, it's great. Just from a writing point, something else you can also do. In terms of some things, like you don't have to be as specific as say 5 p.m. if you don't want to. You can also say at some point, just before sunset, the citizens would disappear within their doors. Because 5 p.m. like I like don't get me wrong, I love what you wrote. Love what you wrote. It's really amazing, and I really want to know more about your world. I'm just like the one question that popped into my mind is why specifically 5 p.m.
Because I wanted to put like that's all I could think of, like a time where before the sun goes down,
And my biggest advice for that is if you can't think of a specific time, then just say at some point before sunset, because it's okay to be vague. Because the entire point here, from what I'm gathering, is that they hide before it gets to nighttime.
Yeah.
So as long as that so as long as that feeling's still, as long as that message can still be inferred, then feel free to use just vague timelines. You don't have to use specific times if you don't want to get confused. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm not trying to say you shouldn't use 5 p.m. I'm just saying, like, if you don't want to use specific times, then just say like before sunset, just after noon, that kind of stuff. Sometimes vague can be your friend.
I think yeah, I'll take that I'll note that, because it's even like I feel like that kind of adds with the tone of the story, the mood kind of thing. Because like in general, the story is like kind of like creepy-ish in a way. So like,
You gotta be honest though. I want to read your world. I just don't want to live in it because I want to live in a world where at nighttime you have to be inside, otherwise it eats you. But yeah, it's really nicely done. Really nicely done. I hope your world goes well.
thank you.
So does anyone else have anything they want to share? Okay then. So if that's that, then thank you so much for joining. I really hope that I was able to enlighten you a little bit more about world building. If there are any other questions that you have about it that I didn't cover, or that you just don't want to say in front of a lot of people, just feel free to send us through on the email. That's partly what it's for. And yeah, I'm always happy to look at the worlds you guys would make. So if you send InkSoc an email and it's about world building, I'll be happy to take a look at it and give you any advice I can about it. Just keep in mind that my speciality, for lack of a better term, is in fantasy and using flowery wordplay. So if you need any help on those two aspects, then that's great. I'm just telling you this because other genres aren't typically my best, so we say, my best work, but I'm always happy to help where I can. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed my session. I really hope you guys stay well during this time. Also, I really hope you guys stay warm during this time, because holy cow, it was cold today. so yeah, I hope you guys all have a good week and good luck with your studies. Please stay warm.